Chapter 56 Law and the Doctrine of God. An important and central aspect of the doctrine of God, rarely if ever discussed, is the fact that the living God of the Bible is the lawgiver. The implications of this are enormous. First, because, as God defines himself, he is eternal and changes not, the law which expresses his being is likewise the same. It expresses his nature. The gods of paganism are changeable and evolving, but the living God does not change. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Malachi 3:6, Hebrews 13:8. Second, the fact of the law means man's accountability and responsibility. Even some animals are accountable for what they do. Exodus 21:28-32. Whether man likes it or not, the law implies that man has the freedom to sin and also the freedom to obey God. All too many people are unhappy over this freedom. They echo the cry reported by Paul, "Why hast thou made me thus?" Romans 9:20. Man sees it as God's fault that he can sin. While man wants the freedom to be his own God, Genesis 3:5, he at the same time refuses to be accountable. He sees himself as responsible to none, neither God nor man. The freedom to sin is the privilege of growth. In pagan traditions such as Greek and Roman, the gods sin freely as the privilege of their status, whereas in the biblical faith, God is all holy and all righteous, unchanging in all his being. He is therefore the God of law, unchanging law. Sin is always sin against the Almighty. Man therefore lives in a world of God-ordained and unchanging law. Third, the fact of God's law gives certainty to life. Right is forever right and wrong is forever wrong. It's not necessary to wait for election returns to know good from evil, right from wrong. Fourth, this means that the doctrine of God requires that the doctrine of law and morality manifest the same certainty and unchanging nature that theology manifests. From Ezekiel 22:16 through 25:17, the repeated refrain is, "And they shall know that I am the Lord." God's judgments in terms of his law shall make him known as the living God, the God who enforces his unchanging law. The law is a revelation of God, of who he is and what he does and shall do. Fifth, to try to bypass the law in understanding God is to reduce God to the mindless level of the mystery religion deities, a vague, mystical idea or influence. The mystery religions can only be compared to Christianity if we omit God's law from his revelation. Biblical religion gives us not a mystical faith, but an ethical law that expresses a mandatory way of life. Sixth, it is ultimately atheism to deny God's law, because then we are left with a somewhat Barthian idea of God as a deity with an unknown nature as well as a questionable existence. The question is, did we make God or did God make us? Because God is the creator, he is the lawgiver, it is his law that governs us. Seventh, to deny God his law while insisting on his being is to posit a God who is both good and evil, and yet neither. He is merely being without nature. Such a God is closer to Hindu gods who equally do good and evil from the human perspective because they are beyond good and evil. They have no fixed nature, and their self-expression is unpredictable and terrifying. Such gods are juggernauts who destroy everything in their path. They are beyond good and evil and are terrifying in all their being. Instead of being unchangeable, the gods without law are changeable in all their being, never the same and never either good or evil. They may one day hate all sin and on another delight in it. They are never mostly just because they deny all unchanging truth and justice. Such a God or gods are madness in both the spiritual and physical spheres, because for them no certainty exists anywhere. It is absurd to speak of the law of gravity or the second law of thermodynamics when denying God an eternal and unchanging nature. A changeable or an evolving God gives us only a universe of instability. 8th, to believe in God's eternal decree means to believe that He is eternally the same in His being and His works, and that His eternal self-consistency expresses itself in His laws. God reveals Himself in His laws, and their inscriptured status is a witness to this unchanging nature. Sin is always sin, justice always justice. God's providence is possible because God's being and purposes are unchanging. His providence means His consistency. Sin is a rebellion against God and His unchanging nature and purpose, but God's providence and law work to make everything man may do work together for the fulfillment of God's purposes. Much more can be said, but it should be apparent now how basic law is to the understanding of God's nature and being. Law is, in itself, a central aspect of God's self-revelation.